The zombies are coming.
I have always been a big fan of the zombie genre, so I guess it was only a matter of time that I would build a diorama which included the undead in all their ghastly glory. Hi there, and thank you for joining us on our channel. As AMC's Walking Dead TV series enters its final season, I thought it would be fun to create a diorama which centers around one of my favorite characters from their spin-off series, Fear the Walking Dead. No, not that one. Nope, not that one either. While I do love all of these characters, this one will always be my favorite. If there ever is a zombie apocalypse, this would be my vehicle of choice.
John! John!
I realized that the MRAP used in the TV series is actually the 6-wheeled BAE Systems Cayman, which is a totally different vehicle from the one that I chose. It's just that I've always liked the look of the Maxxpro, as it has a tough, compact exterior, giving it the look of serious business. So I decided to modify it into an alternative vehicle, which, like the Cayman, is capable of kicking major zombie butt.
The
35 scale Panda Maxxpro model is highly detailed, but some parts were a tight fit, so it's not a kit for the faint-hearted. Also, if you want some practice in removing injector pin marks, then this is the kit for you. Even the smallest of parts seem to have redundant bits of plastic which needed to be removed. Besides these minor annoyances, I would still highly recommend this kit, as the finished model is nicely detailed and definitely worth the extra effort. To kick things off, I assembled all of the interior details. A couple of the sub-assemblies had extensive photo etch parts, and I decided to try something different to get the parts all glued up. Instead of the trusty old super glue with baking soda trick, I decided to use some UV resin instead. This worked very well. It was quick and easy, as the resin cured within seconds after I used the UV light, and I managed to build everything with less effort than I usually had with photo etch parts. That said, the bonds which formed were not as strong as those formed by the superglue and baking soda method, so I wouldn't recommend UV resin for joining up any load-bearing parts. To match the greenish-grey color of the interior in the reference pictures, I loaded up the airbrush with some Tamiya XF22 and applied it straight onto the bare plastic. Once dry, the resulting color was fairly close to the one I was hoping for. I applied the same color to all of the seats and the other fiddly interior bits. While I waited for the paint to dry, I laid down the decals for the dashboard and added some microsol to allow the decals to conform to the underlying details. All of the bits and pieces of the interior were glued together, and the front seats were painted in desert sand, while the steering wheel received a coat of German grey. After allowing the paint to cure for an hour or so, I put all of the parts together to complete the interior. Using army painted dark tone, I applied a wash to the whole interior in order to create a dirtier, more lived-in look. I assembled the rest of the parts to complete the roof. This section was originally the entrance to the turret of the Maxxpro, and I glued it into place to prepare for the machine gun assembly later on. After removing countless injector pin marks from the underside of the MRAP's cabin, I glued on the armor plating. As a side note, this configuration of a hull raised as far as possible above the ground, combined with a V-shaped undercarriage armor, was originally a feature of South African mine-resistant vehicles, designed to deflect the blast of a landmine or IED away from the occupants of the vehicle. I mixed up a batch of black and hull red paint and used this concoction to add color to the Maxxpro's undercarriage. While looking for reference pictures, I came across a couple of vehicles with blue shock absorbers, and I just had to have these. After a wash with army painted dark tone, they looked pretty authentic. To create a 35 scale version of Althea, or Al as she prefers, I modified the helmet of a Soviet tank driver to look a bit like her beanie, and gave the small figure a black base coat. I applied a zenithal highlight to all parts of the figurine, and then blocked in her various base colors. Then some washes and mid-tone highlights, and she was good to go. After building a very basic release mechanism for the gun housing on the roof, I glued the figurine of Al into the driver's seat. After building the actual housing for the machine guns on the roof, I created some welding bead lines using Mr. Surfacer filling putty. When I installed the MRAP's headlights, I decided to randomly mix 3 warm white LEDs with 3 cool white LEDs, as it was the zombie apocalypse after all, and Al would be using whatever light bulbs she could scavenge. After drilling holes for the lights, I fixed them into place with some UV resin. Unfortunately, our power utility decided to implement load shedding just as I was working with the electronics, so the video footage is a little darker than usual. I had no power to operate the soldering iron, so I improvised and used UV resin to secure the joints in the wires. I made sure to test these lights at every stage of the build to make sure their connections were sound. I waited until the next day to wire up the spotlight for the roof of the vehicle, as I needed electricity to operate the soldering iron. Those LEDs for the spotlight and machine gun muzzle flash needed strong connections, as I was going to be tampering with them constantly before the build was done. As luck would have it, we were hit with another bout of load shedding. It's fun to live in South Africa. I connected all the wires up and waited patiently for the power to return. The muzzle flash from the machine guns which are mounted on the roof will be represented by 2 red LEDs. These will be controlled by an AT Tiny chip connected via a separate circuit. Because the AT Tiny operates at a low voltage, I needed to maximize the voltage each red LED received via the microcontroller. The best way to do this was to solder them not in series, but in a parallel circuit with the controller chip. Instead of the black and red wires which I used for the rest of the lighting, I used orange and blue wires for the machine gun LEDs to make sure they were easily identifiable.
2 hours later.
As an added precaution, to protect them from the 9V battery I was using, I temporarily added a 1 kilo ohm resistor onto the blue wire to prevent the battery from accidentally burning out the LEDs when I tested them. I drilled a small hole in the roof and fed all of the wires through. At this point, I decided to sneak in some interior lighting for the vehicle. A 470 ohm resistor was soldered onto a 3mm white LED. I jerry-rigged a parallel connection to the spotlight circuit and affixed the LED to the underside of the roof with some hot glue. I drilled a couple more holes to create a pathway for the wires all the way through to the undercarriage. Then it was a matter of neatening up these wires and threading them through. Carefully, one by one, I guided the wires of the headlights through towards the rear of the vehicle. Before finalizing the circuit, I did one last test of all the lights to make sure that there were no broken connections. Thankfully, everything seemed to be in order. Here's where I reached the point of no return. All of the sections which were kept separate while I added the electronics needed to be glued together to complete the model. I did one final check to make sure that all of the wires were where they needed to be and that all of the lights were working. Then I committed and glued together the upper and lower parts of the MRAP. The various wires from the headlights were soldered together and connected to the main circuit. Some more hot glue was added to fix the wires in place, and I attached the final part of the Maxxpro's underbody, which I had planned to use as a way to hide most of the wiring. Two photo-etch canister holders were built using UV resin as an adhesive and then attached to the rear of the vehicle using a bit of superglue. I assembled the hinges for the rear door, which was a tricky business, as one needed to be careful not to spill any of the adhesive onto the inside of the hinges, which would render the door immobile. I masked the rear window gratings with post-attack and slotted these plastic parts into place. They fit into their positions quite snugly, so it wasn't necessary to add glue or anything to keep them in place. After gluing in the passenger door, I used some masking tape over the rest of the window gratings, some more post-attack on the headlights, and a piece of cardboard slotted into the area where the windshield would be. I masked off the entire undercarriage and the model was ready for its base coat. I applied a couple of light coats of white surface primer and used some self-adhesive vinyl letters to turn the Maxxpro into a totally kick-ass SWAT truck. For the main color of the body of the vehicle, I mixed equal parts of Tamiya dark sea grey and Tamiya German grey and applied this mixture onto the model using an airbrush. I did the same for all of the smaller parts, which were still attached to their sprue trees and would only be added to the model at the end of the build. I cleaned the airbrush and loaded it up with some dark sea grey, which is a shade lighter than the one already on the model. To add a bit of color modulation to the paint scheme, I applied this lighter color to the middle sections of the various panels which made up the MRAP's body. Once the paint had cured, I carefully peeled away the vinyl letters and was glad to see that they had done their job perfectly. The gun housing was base coated with some red-brown surface primer. Using paints and washes from the Vallejo Rust and Chipping Effect set, I carefully created a rust pattern similar to the one in the reference picture. After removing the paint masks on the windows and undercarriage and adding the clear parts of the windows, I did a few small touch-ups with a paintbrush. The exterior of the vehicle was coated in a Vallejo model wash for dark vehicles, which made the finer surface details a lot more visible. The windshield and headlights were glued in using a small amount of canopy glue. Using the same rust effects set as before, I applied a lot of rust stains and streaks across the body of the Maxxpro, trying to follow the reference pictures as closely as possible. I added some dust effects to the tires, and then glued on all of those fragile bits and pieces such as the rearview mirrors, communication antennas and floodlights. These were also weathered and rusted up to match the rest of the vehicle. In the final step, I glued the machine gun housing to the roof of the vehicle and called her done. Thank you so much for watching. In the next video, I'll paint up all of those crazy zombies and add them to an awesome diorama. Please hit the like button and feel free to subscribe if you enjoy our content. Leave a comment below and tell us all about your exciting model builds. We love to hear from you. Be good to yourself and happy modeling.